This talk is based on research I conducted for my recent book, Great Public Buildings of the Northeast, which examines the architecture of the region's town halls and civic centres. I was inspired to write it because town halls are, in a sense, the most important buildings in any settlement. Not only are they the power bases that govern our communities, but they are specifically designed to represent the town to its citizens, expressing its status, values, and identity. Collectively, these buildings represent the Northeast in all its variety. Surveying them together illuminates the region's historical development, the evolution of architectural taste, and the changing paradigms of local government. The book is a selective survey. It examines 24 town halls or civic centres, including some which have been demolished. In the 18th century, many town halls were funded by aristocratic patrons. Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, erected an imposing town hall at Morpeth in 1714. The architect was Sir John Vanbrugh, who had designed the Earl's stately home, Castle Howard, in North Yorkshire. Vanbrugh was a leading exponent of the Baroque style of architecture. His buildings communicate through superhuman proportions and bold massing, many having what he called a castle air. At Morpeth, the dominant central block is framed by corner towers, producing a dramatic silhouette. This follows the basic configuration of Vanbrugh's country houses, such as Seaton Delaval in Northumberland. In scale and proportion, however, the building is more akin to Vanbrugh's smaller garden structures. The entire facade is rusticated, a term referring to various ways of shaping stone blocks to emphasize them individually, and this gives the building a rugged quality, evoking hypothetical rustic buildings. The detailing of the towers recalls Vanbrugh's first design for Eastbury, a country house in Dorset. He designed this around 1915, so he was probably working on the two buildings at the same time and exchanging motifs between them. You can see that the towers in this design are very similar to those at Morpeth in that they are rectangular rather than square in plan, and they terminate with massive upper stages pierced by round-headed arches, and they're crowned with open pediments. The pediment is that triangular form at the top of the tower, and if it's an open pediment, it means the lower bar of the pediment is missing. The towers actually resemble sentry boxes, perhaps revealing Vanbrugh's nostalgia for military fortifications, because he was a former soldier. Vanbrugh's building was apparently destroyed by fire in the 1860s and rebuilt in 1868 to 70 by the talented and versatile Newcastle architect R. J. Johnson. His facade was said to be an exact facsimile of the original. Behind the facade, Johnson designed a whole new suite of rooms, but these were in a complementary 18th century style to match the facade. This room served as a courthouse, guildhall, and ballroom. The grand fireplace was built of Caen stone from Normandy, and the elaborate wooden overmantel displayed armorial bearings of the Earls of Carlisle, who funded the original building and the reconstruction of the 1860s, infusing the building with signs of aristocratic power. Elsewhere in Northumberland, Berwick Town Hall echoes the rugged spirit of Vanbrugh, demonstrating his influence in the county. This was built by the local guild in 1754 to 61 and designed by Joseph Dodds, a master carpenter, who took care to inscribe his name on the building. The design bears a clear resemblance to James Gibbs' church of St Martin in the Fields in London of 1722 to 26, a highly influential building due to its unconventional juxtaposition of a classical temple portico and soaring spire. At the top of the portico is a triangular pediment, and this features a superb representation of the borough's coat of arms, a clear expression of civic identity. The interior retains a plaster relief of Justice executed by Joseph Alexander in 1789, although the seating dates from the 1970s, an era of local government reform. In the 19th century, urban expansion necessitated a new system of local government. The Municipal Reform Act of 1835 established 178 municipal corporations, each governed by an elected council. This growth in bureaucracy demanded buildings for its administration, so town halls became one of the most important building types of the 19th century. In terms of patronage, municipal and commercial bodies replaced the aristocratic patrons of the 18th century. The usual way of obtaining designs was to hold an architectural competition. However, many of these were mismanaged and drew accusations of corruption. This brings us to John Johnston. He was a Scottish architect based in Newcastle, and he had the uncanny knack of obtaining civic commissions, whether or not he had actually won the competition. And from time to time, he was accused of using backstair influence. His design for Newcastle Town Hall came second in the competition, but was ultimately chosen by the corporation and executed. This was one of the first town halls in the country to make free use of classical and Renaissance styles, breaking with academic tradition by blending them together. Town halls were notoriously complex buildings, and this eclectic approach gave the architects much more flexibility. The main elevation featured sculptures representing the trade and commerce of the time, all carved by the Newcastle builder and stonemason Sir Walter Scott. The site abutted a corn exchange. At Johnson's suggestion, this was pulled down and rebuilt on more substantial foundations. This allowed a new story to be constructed above it, and this housed a music hall, complete with a new organ and carvings of musical instruments in the woodwork. The building drew criticism from the architectural press. Building News, a leading architectural journal, described it as a wretched confusion of old classic, badly adapted from various works by Inigo Jones, Sir Christopher Wren, and other classical architects. The building was allowed to deteriorate in the 20th century and was ultimately demolished in 1973, but fragments of its stonework were incorporated into the faceless office blocks erected on the site. The building of Bishop Auckland Town Hall was also controversial. A competition was held in 1860, and this was won by John Philpot Jones, an Irish architect based in London. In the course of my research, I discovered that he actually produced two designs, one in the Gothic style and one classical. The committee chose the Gothic design because they didn't want the building to clash with the Gothic church of St Anne nearby. You can see that church on the right-hand side of this image. Although Jones won the competition, the committee appointed John Johnston to modify his design. Jones asked for his drawings back, and they were returned, but not before tracings had been taken, and this allowed Johnston to replicate Jones' design, although he did simplify it to reduce the costs. He omitted the oriel window, which you can see projecting at the centre of the facade. He also omitted the tower. Bishop Auckland Town Hall was one of the first in the country to use French mansard roofs. These are the trapezoid roofs that you can see at the top of the building. They originated from French Renaissance architecture and are named after the French architect François Mansart. They helped to articulate the mass of large buildings, which would otherwise look blocky and monolithic. And they also had the advantage that they could be adapted for classical or Gothic designs. The architecture of the late Victorian period reveals a desire to abandon the rigidities of classical and Gothic architecture, resulting in eclectic designs based on Italian and French Renaissance precedents. Hexham Town Hall was yet another civic building by John Johnston, exemplifying his free Renaissance style. The composition is loosely Palladian, divided into three distinct blocks. Surprisingly, the town hall did not occupy the central block as we might expect, but lay in the south wing. The central block was occupied by a corn exchange, demonstrating how important agriculture was to Hexham's economy. Primary sources indicate that The central pediment above the entrance was originally surmounted by a figure of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture. Her left hand clasped a cornucopia, or horn of plenty, and her right hand a sickle. These elements expressed, through the symbolic language of classical gods, the importance of bountiful harvests. The former Corn Exchange has been converted into a library, but it's still possible to appreciate the beauty of the Victorian engineering. Johnston's design for Gateshead Town Hall came last in the competition, but mysteriously he was appointed architect. Like Hexham, the building was designed in a free Renaissance style, in this case with Venetian elements, which are mostly apparent in the fenestration or the windows. The crowning pediment has allegorical figures of commerce, industry, and justice, representing standard civic values of the period, although the central figure has since been removed. Surmounting the group is a statue of Queen Victoria. This brings us to the ideological function of town halls. Ostensibly, they were visible symbols of democracy, but in many cases, their construction was financed by powerful private citizens, typically industrial magnates. Potent myths of their enterprise and benevolence were woven into the fabric of town halls by means of statuary, inscriptions, and stained glass. With this splendid scenography, Victorian town halls were essentially theatres of capitalism, allegorical representations of industry, commerce, and the arts, functioned in hegemonic terms, presenting the values of the elite as the common sense values of all. Middlesbrough Town Hall was built by the industrial titans of this Victorian new town. It was designed by George Gordon Hoskins in a French Gothic style of the 13th century, intended to give Middlesbrough the sense of historical pedigree that it lacked, having been built rapidly in the 19th century. The building followed a medieval monastic plan, framing a courtyard, and was dominated by its clock tower. The facades are arrayed with sculpture expressing the paternalistic ideals of Middlesbrough's ruling class. Statues representing commerce, painting, literature, and music portrayed the town as an enlightened metropolis where capitalism was the wellspring of the arts. These were sculpted by H. T. Margetson of Chelsea at a cost of £50 each. The interior houses perhaps the finest council chamber in the northeast, with councillors' seating arranged in a horseshoe as recommended by experts in Victorian town hall design. And of course, Middlesbrough has had the sense to retain its town hall. The history of Sunderland's municipal architecture is a tragic saga involving a much-loved Victorian town hall and a controversial but innovative civic centre, both of which fell prey to the wrecking ball. The competition for Sunderland Town Hall was dogged by accusations of corruption. The competition was judged by Alfred Waterhouse, who was a highly esteemed architect, but it was won by Brightwen Binyon of Ipswich, who had trained under Waterhouse. The competition was anonymous, but it's highly likely that Waterhouse would have recognised Binyon's drawing style and handwriting. Nevertheless, this was a dignified building. Rising from a rusticated base, the facades combined bold classical forms with Renaissance details. The corners were treated as pavilions and crowned by mansard roofs. The entire structure was faced with Prudham stone from Northumberland. Here we can see the ground floor plan and first floor plan, which gives an idea of the various spaces and functions which town halls had to incorporate. A visitor would enter the building through the vestibule and be taken into the grand stair hall, and then would be swept up to the first floor, where they may be granted access to the council chamber and adjoining mayor's parlour. This is an archival photograph of the grand stair hall, which some Sunderland residents still remember. The interiors were worked in Dennick stone from Northumberland, with columns of polished red granite. Many town halls had towers, but most of these were built for visual impact and had no functional justification. Sunderland Town Hall was an exception. The building was ventilated by means of extraction flues carried into a shaft in the tower. Tragically, Sunderland Town Hall was demolished in 1971 by the then Tory Council, an ignominious fate for the embodiment of Sunderland's civic pride. Generally, my book on town halls focuses on towns with a population of at least 10,000 people. An exception is Corbridge, which has a smaller population, but I decided to include the town hall because it's such a charming building. Corbridge is one of the most picturesque towns in Northumberland, and Frank Emley designed its town hall shortly before migrating to South Africa for health reasons, after which he practiced in Johannesburg. The site was donated by Farquhar M. Lang, a wealthy businessman who lived nearby at Farnley Grange. He also funded the building of the tower. His brother Alexander Lang funded the Lang Art Gallery in Newcastle. Built in 1887, the town hall is a charming building reflecting the generalised neo-vernacular aesthetic that emerged in fashionable architecture of the day. Specifically, it recalls the work of Norman Shaw, who is best known as the architect of Cragside. Shaw also used these distinctive windows, which are very quaint in form and which are known as Ipswich windows because they are used in the vernacular buildings of that town and its county of Suffolk. The building is free of the bombastic effects common in Victorian town halls and is very modest in comparison. A contemporaneous commentator wrote, "Modern Corbridge will open the doors and rejoice in the possession of a town hall, just as ancient Corbridge, an important Roman town, rejoiced in its forum." The turn of the century witnessed a revival of the exuberant Baroque architecture of Vanbrugh and others. It became almost an official idiom for government buildings, a triumphalist expression of national and civic pride, at a time when the British Empire was at the height of its power. Jarrow Town Hall was designed by the obscure Fred Reynoldson. The external facing consists of bright red brick and terracotta, giving the building a fiery colour. There was a turn of the century fashion for architectural ceramics and chromatic facades. The Dorman Museum in Middlesbrough and Old Shire Hall in Durham are further examples. However, Sir Nicolaus Pevsner called Jarrow Town Hall vulgar due to what he saw as its excessive ornamentation and overt colour. The council chamber houses a mayor's dais in fumed oak, and stained glass windows commemorate the philanthropy of local industrialists and politicians such as Sir Charles Palmer, again functioning in hegemonic terms. South Shields Town Hall was designed by Ernest Fetch of London. The South Shields Municipal Reform League objected to what it saw as the excessive cost of the building, and as a result, the specifications were changed. Instead of using granite for the stone around the steps, local Heworth stone was substituted, and wrought iron was used instead of bronze. Transcending these difficulties, South Shields Town Hall emerged as the region's finest civic building of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, a true civic palace, serene despite its grandeur. The centrepiece is a sublime edicule framing the entrance. Allegorical figures were carved by Herbert Charles Binney. A heroic Neptune and eroticized nymph of the time recline on the pediment, the latter reflecting the influence of the Art Nouveau style that was flourishing in Europe at this time. A triumphant figure of Britannia is seated at the apex of the pediment. In this building, symmetry is disrupted by the dramatic addition of a clock tower. This was characteristic of Edwardian Baroque architecture. Statues representing the four seasons stand at the corners of the tower, again sculpted by Binney, and a weather vane in the form of an Elizabethan galleon proclaims the town's maritime prowess. The interior is equally fine, from the magnificent foyer the visitor is expertly choreographed through a graceful sequence of columned marbled halls. The climax is the council chamber, where the seating is arranged in an elongated horseshoe, again as recommended by experts in town hall design. At one time, the building housed a clinic for infectious diseases, and for this reason the corridors were lined with glazed brick. Combined with the Art Nouveau stained glass, the iridescent green had a stunning effect. In the 20th century, post-war ideals of democracy engendered a new conception of local government. Combined with the radical doctrines of modernist architecture, this produced a spate of civic centres conceived as beacons of modernity and political transparency. Nevertheless, some of these buildings failed to communicate with the public, becoming inadvertent symbols of faceless bureaucracy. The greatest civic building in the northeast is Newcastle Civic Centre. The city architect George W. Kenyon designed it in 1950, but due to national restrictions on capital expenditure, it didn't open until 1968, making it rather old-fashioned when it was finally opened. Nevertheless, it confidently represents Newcastle on an international stage by synthesizing a range of international influences. Kenyon's design was clearly inspired by the Dutch modernism of Willem Dudok's Hilversum Town Hall, which has a similar stark tower anchoring the composition and an assembly of cubic forms. Despite the severity of its forms, the entire complex was finished to an exceptionally high specification using lavish materials such as marble and exotic woods from Africa, India, and South America. This suggests the influence of the Bauhaus architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, whose work combined formal purity with a rich material palette. Modernism was conceived as a universal language of design, stripped of national and regional signifiers, enabling it to transcend national boundaries. Departing from this universalist ethos, Newcastle Civic Centre uses a range of historical references to crystallise Newcastle's cultural identity. The iconic seahorses that crown the tower are derived from Newcastle's coat of arms and signify the city's former status as a port. David Wynn's sculpture River God Tyne evokes Newcastle's ancient past, alluding to the Roman concept of river deities. The building incorporates many references to Scandinavia to define Newcastle as a northern capital. The quadrangle bears resemblance to Oslo City Hall, which was built of brown brick with a regular disposition of windows and which incorporated bronze sculptures evoking the aesthetic of Nordic Romanticism. This is the quadrangle at Newcastle, and you can see the range at the rear of the image is very much like Oslo City Hall. In the foreground, you can see David Wynn's sculpture Swans in Flight, which represents the countries of Scandinavia in order of their creation as independent states. Entering the building, the Great Hall is lined with black Norwegian otter slate, as you can see on the left, and irregular bands of English oak, as you can see on the right. The ground floor is lined with Verde Viana marble from Portugal. The jewel-like cascade of a crystal chandelier dominates the space. This is the work of Alfred Burgess Reed. Departing from the industrial aesthetic he developed after visiting the Bauhaus, it incorporates historic elements from Newcastle's coat of arms. The banqueting hall evokes the baronial halls of Northumbrian castles. Food is served through the arches you can see on the right, and these house retractable cast aluminium grills by Geoffrey Clark. Backed with orange fabric, the arches resemble roaring fireplaces when illuminated, again recalling medieval dining halls. An abstract tapestry by the important post-war British painter John Piper is visible in the corner, evoking the landscapes and geology of Northumberland. In the council chamber, panels of cedar of Lebanon unify the building. These were designed with abstract sculptural forms to reduce echoes within the chamber. Similarly, a ceiling of acoustic plaster sweeps up to a central oculus or eye-shaped window, admitting natural light, very much in the manner of the Pantheon in Rome. The chairs were designed by the talented Danish furniture maker Arne Vodder. They feature electronic voting panels reflecting the space-age design of the 1960s. This is one of the committee rooms, again graced with furniture by Arne Vodder. The carpet is a spectacular design combining seahorse motifs with castle forms, and the same design is used throughout many spaces of the building in a range of vibrant colours. The effect is almost psychedelic, reflecting the wider design culture of the 60s. While Newcastle Civic Centre seemed old-fashioned when it opened in 1968, Sunderland Civic Centre, opened only 2 years later, was far more contemporary. The building had a strong horizontal emphasis and was conceived as a series of horizontal decks which cascaded down, following the contours of the topography in the manner advocated by the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. This gave it the character of a geological formation rather than an architectural monument. And this had a very modest effect, blending the building into the landscape. It was designed by John S. Bonington, who worked in the office of Sir Basil Spence. This is a very rare photograph showing Spence and Bonington examining a model of the building, ironically within the council chamber of Sunderland Town Hall, shortly before it was destroyed. This is the central administrative core, which fused the building's two hexagonal rings together. And this is the Civic Suite, which projected at the southern end of the site. Exterior and interior are unified by a modest material palette of brindled engineering bricks and tiles. This is the entrance to the former council chamber. In this consistent use of material, the building was probably influenced by Seinäjoki Town Hall by the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto. We can see that here. The use of ceramics in the form of brick contrast with the organic woodwork of the ceiling. A similar effect was achieved in the superb council chamber of Sunderland Civic Centre, a hexagonal sanctum lined with brick and enclosed by a ceiling of Colombian pine. The building won the Duke of Edinburgh's Design Prize in 1973, although when Derek Clark of the Design Council visited Sunderland to set up the ceremony, he broke his nose by walking into the glass doors. Their design was a bit too modern for him, said a spokesperson. Unique among the region's civic buildings was Chester Street Civic Centre. Introducing the high-tech style of architecture to the region, this was a sleek assembly of silver planes enclosing a multicoloured riot of structural and mechanical components. The high-tech movement embraced technology and engineering as a basis for architecture in a period when modernism was fragmenting. The most famous examples are the Pompidou Centre in Paris and Lloyd's of London, although Chester Street Civic Centre was much smaller than these technocratic fantasies. Nevertheless, the Civic Centre displayed an exaggerated mechanical aesthetic, exposing its framework and service ducts instead of hiding them away. In this specific context, the mechanical imagery perhaps suggested nostalgia for the region's lost industries. Poor ground conditions necessitated a lightweight building, so the centre was system built using a steel portal frame. This was clad in a silver skin of a leucobond consisting of aluminium and polyethylene layers. It was necessary to blend this somewhat alien structure into its landscape, and this was achieved by the architect Henty Lowe. Ingeniously, he used silver birch trees to echo the silvered forms of the building in an organic way, blending it into its setting. Nevertheless, local residents nicknamed it Mission Control. To create a welcoming experience, a mall ran through the full length of the building, an element more familiar from retail complexes of the period. Festooned with vegetation and partly carpeted in green astroturf, it exemplified the jungle aesthetic favoured by leisure centres of the 1980s. The rest of the ground floor was a bureau landschaft or office landscape. This was an office planning system developed in Germany, which was meant to be democratic because everyone worked on the same level. The council chamber had a futurist colour palette with a grey carpet, silver walls, and chairs in pink fabric. Chester Street Civic Centre embodied an ethos of democratic local government. Sadly, however, it was demolished in 2014. These buildings and others are examined in my book Great Public Buildings of the North East, which is available from Amberley Publishing.